And I would even go so far as to say that after that war ends, as all wars must end, if that problem of the internal dynamic of Ukraine is not resolved, the situation will not be any better.
Thank you very much for being with us. It's an honor for us, for the Georgian Public Broadcasting. I'll start with the first question, about which you have talked extensively in other occasions and also in your book, The Tragedy of Ukraine. You discussed that. It's about the real roots of Russia-Ukraine conflict. So in your book, you also mentioned that this conflict has a long-term dynamic, but it also has the internal domestic roots. So could you also now elaborate on that, please?
Most Western analysts focus on the external aggression, that aspect of the conflict. But as I point out, one of the reasons such an attack was even possible was the internal divisions of Ukraine. The country, I would say, going back to a famous phrase that the US President Abraham Lincoln once said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And unfortunately, the history of Ukraine, even before its origins, even before World War I, has been one of conflict between different components of Ukrainian society, some of them wanting to be more distinctive from its neighbors and to emphasizing their distinctive national identity against the Poles, against the Russians, against Jews over time, against Hungarians, to sort of separate themselves, even within their own country, Ukraine, from all these different nationalities. And others, more in the eastern part of Ukraine, would say, well, we have always been a mixed population and have always lived here. So to make these divisions will only create social conflict. And since 1991, since the very moment of independence, this tension can be traced through the political discourse of Ukraine, with rising nationalism, the rise of groups that really want to emphasize a monolithic and monoethnic Ukraine versus those who would be perfectly content to see a modern Ukraine as a multi-ethnic nation, and even a federalized nation. And that conflict has not been resolved, and I think very strongly contributed to the ultimate war, the war that we're seeing today. And I would even go so far as to say that after that war ends, as all wars must end, if that problem of the internal dynamic of Ukraine is not resolved, the situation will not be any better.
So this is part of the discussion which in your book you call a fatal attraction of the far right, I suppose. There is something that the world, and especially Georgia, can learn from these discussions. So what do you think we can somehow learn from this experience of far-rightization also of Ukraine, which is also a term that is often applied for explaining this internal dynamics which you just mentioned?
The example of the rise of extremist nationalism in Ukraine is logical. It's something that had occurred already in the 1920s and 1930s and led to World War II. And I'm hardly the first to point this out. Many great political scientists, including the father of Realpolitik, Hans Morgenthau, pointed out that nationalism is a form of political religion, and it demands the same sort of obedience and deference to its value the supremacy of the nation over all other values, over all other goods, which ultimately leads to conflict within the nation itself. Because every nation, no matter how monolithic it may seem, has visitors, has people who emigrate to that nation, who immigrate as well as emigrate. There are no nations in the world that are truly mono-ethnic. There are always pockets here and there. And there are very many families that are mixed. And as a result, when you say, well, the only real people who are worthy of being considered true Georgians, Ukrainians, Mexicans, whatever the case may be, are people, then you have to, are people of a certain type, well, then you create exclusive categories. A sort of political apartheid, if you will, automatically enters into play. And as a result, it creates frictions. And one of the things I pointed out at the conference today is that over the long run, it doesn't just lead to conflict among the different constituencies in the state, it also unites many people against the state itself, because the state then has to enforce these ethnic norms, these linguistic norms, these religious norms, and it's not going to affect just the minorities anymore. It's going to eventually include everyone. There's a famous story that my professor once told me, a famous British diplomat, and he said, once a Greek city-state developed the perfect rules for their society. And they knew they were perfect, so they decided that they would never change them. And as a result, he said, within a generation, no one was left there because everyone either destroyed each other in conflict or fled. And that's the problem with nationalism. It's one set of rules for everybody, and everyone has to conform. And you can't fight it, so you have to leave or overthrow it.
You just mentioned this exclusive project of nationalism that definitely excludes some groups and includes those who are meant to be included. Who do you think are the allies of the far-right groups in this exclusive project? Those whom we don't know by their names as far-right groups, but they are known to be, or they can be taken as being in alliance with the far-right groups.
In Ukraine, in particular, although I don't think this is unique to Ukraine, but again is typical of what happens in these circumstances. After the fall of the Soviet Union, what happened there was that émigré communities, which had kept alive a certain image for themselves and their children when they were forced to flee the Soviet Union, returned. And having made, in some cases, a good living in the West, brought money and began to funnel that money from their émigré organizations into nationalist groups, supporting them. In the case of Western Ukraine, creating camps for their children to indoctrinate them into a more nationalistic and militaristic spirit. It is not likely that they wanted the ultimate outcome to be a far-right dictatorship, because in many cases the people who fled the collapse of the end of World War II saw many of the bad effects that the Nazi regime had, as well as the Soviet regime. And so they didn't want to replace that. But political limitations create extremism. And of course, young people, being enthusiastic in their passions, then take a good idea which needs to be applied gently and subtly and go, let's go all the way. You know, let's finish the job. Let's make sure that only the right people are left, and then we'll have a perfect society. And that's a problem, because that sort of perfection, people eventually learn, is impossible to achieve. And the attempt to achieve it leads to very bad consequences in society, leads to divisions that become very strongly entrenched. And then people begin to associate, oh, you're from that group or that region of the country. Oh, I know you're bad people. And then it creates a whole new set of problems that carry over from personal and emotional and sort of cultural sensitivities directly into politics.
I would like to connect this discussion also with the post-90s elite formation. So does this project has to do with how elite formation took shape in the post-Soviet period?
I think so, and but in an indirect way. In other words, elites seek power and influence, and in the effort to do so, they will manipulate, without necessarily believing themselves, but they will manipulate the opinions of others. And so one of the things that many people have talked about in Ukraine is that oligarchs, without necessarily revealing what their own personal preferences would be, nevertheless have an interest in pitting one group against another, against funding or in favor of funding one region where they gain control, and then using that influence to undermine other regions and oligarchs in other regions. And in order to build up one region and to diminish the influence of another, they will rely on very base nationalistic prejudices or religious prejudices, or say, well, those people speak that language and they're not really Ukrainians because, they speak Russian or they speak Hungarian or Polish at home, and how reliable are they? So it's not that it's not clear to me at least that they want one type of society or another. What they seek is their own dominance, and they will manipulate and use nationalism to their advantage to achieve that political and financial objective for themselves.
My next question would be about some comparable aspects between Ukraine and Georgia, and probably also to other post-Soviet countries. Well, in the literature also about the post-Soviet transformation, there are these comparable similarities with regards to how these countries have become vulnerable to external influences, and how their domestic dynamics, internal political dynamics, have been shaped by discourses from elsewhere without the organic civil society development, or so on and so on. So why do you think this happened? Like, why they were so vulnerable in this historical period, which we know as the post-Soviet times?
Two things lead to this. One is the lack of, as you mentioned, actual independent grassroots, non-governmental organizations. Those take time to develop. And emerging from the Soviet Union, everything was state-run. And as a result, those individual aspects didn't have the ability to develop. And they just take a generation or two for that tradition to emerge and to become an independent force in and of itself, regardless of whether the state supports it or not. So that wasn't the case, and therefore the civil alternative was weak. The other is that at that very moment when there is a demand for this kind of support, and there is an absence of a domestic base for it, foreign powers can always come in and say, oh, we can provide the money, we can provide the know-how, and we can provide even support of certain personalities and guidance, to steer you in the right direction, which is where you should want to go. But none of this is new. This is what the Austro-Hungarian Empire did to the Russian Empire on the eve of World War I. Pitting different minorities in the Russian Empire against each other in order to advance the interests of Austro-Hungary. Germany did the same thing in Poland, in the Czech Republic, so Sudetenland. And this is an old pattern that is a familiar one. As a matter of fact, someone pointed out to me that there are really no purely foreign wars, because every foreign war, one country attacking another, includes a component in which the aggressor utilizes the weaknesses of the other side against each other. So there's always an aspect of every conflict that involves the support of some domestic group by the external force, which is why if you really want to encourage or protect sovereignty, I think the best thing to do is to really look to your own resources and avoid looking for support externally, because every external support has a price tag attached to it. If you do this, we'll give you this. But then the price gets higher and higher as the dependence on the external source of funding and influence grows. So it's like a drug, a bit of a drug dependency. You know, at first the dealer gives you a very good price for the drugs that you want, but then once you're hooked, the price goes up. And that's the kind of situation you want to avoid. You want to be self-reliant, largely, but of course not isolated from the world. Rely on every country should rely on its own traditions first and foremost, and then look around the world and say, oh, but you know, the Japanese do that well. Oh, the Tanzanians do this very well. And we can learn from this and this. And in the process of selecting, you can improve what is already good enough and maybe make it a little better. So it's a combination of factors. Not isolating yourself, but knowing your own true value, I think, is the best guide in these matters.
There's also some kind of a political economy aspect of diffusing these ideas, right? So we know that currently this whole discussion about the external power and external interest that reflects itself in the domestic politics. I mean, this discussion is somehow activated for the first time in the last 30 years. It's still problematic to grasp in a serious manner what constitutes this external influence. So I think it still needs some sort of serious consideration of what it can be and what it cannot. So it's interesting that you just mentioned it also now. But yeah, how should we avoid some two edges of extreme that this discussion can bring?
Well, the stronger the domestic core set of values is and the consensus around it, the easier it is to identify what is different from it or what doesn't mesh very well with the core values. I would differ a little bit in your assessment of that this is a recent phenomenon. Actually, I think this kind of phenomenon is at least a century and a half or more old. The difference, however, is the technology that gets applied to it now. In other words, the technology reaches many more people and can be used to spread ideas that previously a new idea might take years to disseminate. And in that process of taking years to be diffused and to gain a certain resonance in society, foreign ideas, a natural reaction to it domestically can emerge, and there can be an actual debate as a result. But now, with the internet being everywhere, all sorts of ideas hit people who are unprepared for them very often, instantly, and they don't know how to respond, except either by violent rejection, and I mean that just like, no, that's just completely wrong, that's can't be accepted, and sometimes that leads to actual violence or to political sort of rejection, or it just takes over very quickly because people don't know how to respond. And they say, well, if someone as smart as Professor so-and-so says so, I guess it must be true, and they just go with that. There's not enough time in politics anymore to deliberate and to ponder. It would be nice if we could learn to take more time to think and to wait and before we assess anything. And maybe, I'm not in favor of shutting any news outlet or any source of information down, but it would be very good and healthy for society if people themselves, and they do sometimes, they're in the movements now I see where they say, okay, internet only, 1 hour a day. Or for children, I'm supervising, the internet, and I want to explain what is going on to my children, and to really have the kind of discussion about what it is that people are being exposed to. A kind of computer literacy is becoming a movement, certainly in the United States, for people who, and other countries as well, who are lost now in the flow of information that they're getting. Some of which is reliable, and some of which is just fantasy.
Just a simple clarification before the next question. When I was talking about the emergence of discourse in recent period, I meant Georgian internal politics mostly, because we face this discussion about what foreign influence constitutes, not since very long.
Right.
So that was my point. My next question would be also about Georgia in the context of Russia-Ukraine war. So how do you see this role? I mean, a lot of people have been also assessing Georgia's position as some sort of a pragmatic foreign policy, and we also today heard about that in the conference. So how do you think about that?
Well, my personal concern in the conflict in Ukraine is that it end and that lives stop being wasted. So, and I believe that the best way for that to happen as quickly as possible is for direct negotiations between Russian and Ukrainian leaders to take place. The reason they haven't taken place, I think, one of the reasons, is that many other actors seek to be involved. And when they get involved, it is not in the nature of nation states to act benignly. It is in their nature to act in their self-interest. So if someone comes and wants to sell you something, you should be aware that they're selling it for their own profit, not to make you healthier or better. And that's important to remember here. So the best thing would be in the context of other nations and the global situation, for Ukraine and Russia to be left alone to work out and sort out their issues. And I think the nations that are leaving them alone to do that, not commenting, not telling so-and-so to do this or so-and-so to do that, or trying to send assistance as they see it to either party, they're doing something that's this policy of detachment will probably be most beneficial to a long-term peace in Ukraine, because everyone else, be it larger or smaller countries, are trying to tip the scale in favor of one side or another. And when the scale becomes tipped in that way, the end result is unbalanced. Ultimately, the two sides have to decide for themselves, Ukraine and Russia alone, what is the proper balance. And I would say that would be best left to them. And I would also encourage the same attitude for other nations vis-a-vis domestic conflicts in Georgia, in Azerbaijan, elsewhere. The quickest way to resolve a problem is to face it and to say, look, you and I don't get along, and we've had a lot of problems, and here's what my problems are. And what are your problems today? Because everyone else who's interfering or acting as an intermediary is also creating a barrier to a direct dialogue where I can hear what you're saying, I can see you, and now someone else is coming in. You know, it's almost like a family argument. It can be helpful, but only up to a point to have an intermediary. Ultimately, the two sides have to decide themselves, are they going to get along or are they not going to get along?
That was actually supposed to be my last question, but about the future vision of conflict resolution. But since you already mentioned and addressed that, I think I'll end up here. Maybe a bit of an addition to that would be, how do you think the role of these large security organizations like NATO will be after, the future of NATO will be after this Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Well, history tells us that in the quest for stability and peace, nations join collective security organizations. The problem that arises is when there is nothing there, is when they become directed at some greater goal than security. So the evolution of NATO may be an indication of the problems that arise. For example, NATO was a defensive alliance. It was set up that way. And it had rather serious restrictions, no military involvement outside of the area to be defended, which was the membership of the NATO states. Then, and the reason for that was that you don't want to provoke, they didn't want to provoke a retaliation by the Soviet Union. You merely wanted to deter the Soviet Union from further expansion. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, however, that deterrence evaporated, and as a result, NATO fell into an intellectual crisis. Why do we exist? The country against which we were defending no longer exists. But now we have a lot of money, a lot of people, a lot of reasons to continue this. And arguably, the supporters of NATO even said, well, why should we change anything? We won. The model was successful. As a matter of fact, it was so successful, let's expand it. But here's where we should have understood the lessons of diplomatic history, because as soon as it expanded, it needed a new mission. And that new mission became no longer the defense of the West. It became the defense of the West through the expansion of Western influence and ideas. So essentially, an aggressive policy or an expansion of the ideas and ideology of the West. And we began to see maneuvers, not only the territorial expansion, but also military actions taken beginning in Yugoslavia or Serbia outside of the territory and area. And then Iraq, Afghanistan, the Middle East. There are other examples of minor expansion in military activity also in the Mediterranean during the 2000s. So it's now no longer the organization that it once was. But the rhetoric regarding why we are supporting it hasn't changed. And so it's not even accurate to talk about it as a defensive alliance. It is now the bulwark of the West, both for defense and for offense. And that changes the entire picture, not only with respect to Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, but also for China, for the Third World. For many countries now look at NATO and say, who exactly are you? And what are your ambitions? Because senior members of NATO have openly talked about, let's have a NATO in Latin America. Let's have a NATO in Asia. Now, I don't know, obviously China is not going to respond to that very favorably because it unbalances the current state of affairs. which favors them and which they see as being stable. A lot of problems have now arisen. So the future of collective security is to think about it again and to realize that when there are major changes in international politics, the original concept has to change and correspond to the interests of all the nations rather than just the members of one group. So when it arose, NATO took into account the interests of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Once those dissolved, it needed to still take into account the interests of Russia and Eastern European countries, but it failed to do so. So there needs to be a rethinking and a recalibration when the original circumstances under which a security arrangement arose change.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.